Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this event at the Institute for Government. My name is Hannah White. I'm director of the IfG, and as a secret to everyone online, I've already done this introduction once because I started a bit early, so the people in the room are having to hear it all over again. Welcome to this event which we are running today on how we can build external voices into the centre of government. This is a question which the Institute has thought about for some time over our existence, but more particularly recently in the context of our Centre Commission, which we ran over the course of last year. It was a one-year commission, and we were looking particularly at the relationship between the Treasury, Number 10, and the Cabinet Office, and how well equipped they are to run the country. And one of the conclusions that we drew from that commission is that external voices need to be better embedded into decision-making at the centre, and that successive governments haven't done enough to make sure that that happens, either by listening from the centre to voices from the outside, or by recruiting people from the outside to bring their skill and insight into the centre of government. So I'm delighted we're having this opportunity to have this discussion today. Excuse me. Our big thanks to the Charities Aid Foundation, who are sponsoring this event today, and indeed sponsored some of the work of the Commission. It's great to be working with CAF. And I'm very pleased to say we have an excellent panel with us today to discuss these issues and how we can get from where we are now to a more positive picture. So to introduce the panel, I'll introduce the panel in a moment. If you're listening online, after we have a panel discussion, we'll then go to questions. I'll take questions from people here in the room, but also you can send in your questions via Slido. And unless I mess up the technology, I will be able to see your questions popping up on my iPad, and I will go to those as well. So do start sending in your questions. So to introduce my panel, on my far right, we have Sir Ian Cheshire, who is currently Chair of the Channel 4 Board, Chair of Land Securities and Chair of Spire Healthcare Group, and also Chair of King Charles III Charitable Fund. He is also was in the past lead non-exec in the Cabinet Office, and most importantly is a trustee of the Institute for Government. On my immediate right, I'm joined by Baroness Diana Barron, who is a long-standing senior figure in the charitable sector and was most recently Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State in the Department of Education between 2021 and 2024, and prior to that in DCMS. On my left, I have Neil Heslop, who has been the Chief Executive of the Charities Aid Foundation since October 2020. He was previously Chief Executive of the International Disability charity Leonard Cheshire from 2016, and prior to that, spent 25 years in business, holding senior leadership roles in the telecoms industry in North America and Europe. And on my far left, I have Dame Helen Stevenson, who is the Chief Executive of the Charity Commission for England and Wales between 2017 and 2024. So a really excellent panel, I think, to discuss these questions. Neil, I'm going to kick off with you. Give us some big picture thoughts here. Why is it that, in your view, government needs the input of charities? And can you give us any examples of when that has been particularly effective?
Okay, well, good afternoon, and thanks for the question. I think my first observation really would be that the public, private, and third sectors all tend to be good at somewhat different things. And given the nature of some of the challenges for government in terms of policy development, what is clear is that we're confronting an awful lot of very, very complex systemic type issues. And I think as policy gets formulated, what is the most important thing is the executability of those policies and the translation of that into making a real difference in whatever particular area we're talking about. And I think against that backdrop, the translation of policy into a clear strategy, a defined plan, the mobilization of the people and financial and technical resources to actually deliver execution on the front line is the big challenge. And in doing so, having the perspectives drawn from right across the economy, be they from public services or private sector or third sector, has to give ourselves the best possible chance of fundamentally problem solving. Because, I mean, that's what we're all interested in doing in order to make progress and change people's lives.
And is it your view, I mean, do you agree with the conclusion that we drew in the Centre Commission that that hasn't been systematically done as effectively as it could be up to this point?
I think there've been some really great examples that kind of point the way to the art of the possible, that have delivered some quite material things. But I think in your question, you put your finger on it, not really in a systematic way, right across all of the organs of government. And that's where I think the opportunity lies. And I guess, you know, part of our thinking was very much influenced very early on in the pandemic, when we saw a number of things which in those very particular circumstances became possible, that prior to those conditions were not the norm. And I think that from that gives us the inspiration to believe that we could go an awful lot further. And I guess the specific example that I would draw out, which actually is one that Diana will be familiar with, is, as you mentioned, I joined Charities Aid Foundation partway through the first year of the pandemic. And of course, casting our mind back to then, the kind of situation we were in is really forced a lot of things to happen. We at CAF identified a very small amount of money, £4 or £5 million, which was designed to get out to small charities in those very first few weeks to stop charities literally falling over. And at the same time, we started working with some of our corporate partners, in this case, the Association of British Insurers, whose membership, some 37 finance organisations, were really interested in doing their bit in what then became the COVID-19 Support Fund. And together, we partnered on what became the CAF Resilience Fund, and together it responded to government's call for Community Match Challenge. And what that ended up being was taking some 20 million of the 84 million that the ABI brought together, complementing that money from CAF, then being matched by government. And all of a sudden, we had resources of 110 million to do something with. And I think the learnings that we went through about how those parties from those very, very different perspectives shaped the different phases of execution was really quite insightful. And that money, the resources, the delivery experience of those organisations translated into some really important interventions that made a real difference for over the next 2 or 3 years.
That's really interesting and reminds me of some of what we've heard from the new government about sort of how private and charitable sector organisations can leverage both impact and funding and match funding and so on, how they can work with the government on that. We'll come back to that. Helen, can I come to you? You've worked both in government and outside government. You've worked in the Cabinet Office, but also in the voluntary sector. What's your view of what government gets right and wrong when it comes to external engagement?
Yeah, and I wonder if the question is more, why does it go right and why does it go wrong? And I think when I was thinking about that, I was thinking about, well, actually my own experience of coming into government from the outside. I had worked in the public sector, but not in central government. And I joined, I became a civil servant in the Office for the Third Sector, which some of you will remember, which was set up in 2007 by the then Prime Minister Gordon Brown, and the First Minister was Ed Miliband. And so I suppose what was the kind of environment that meant that I think was successful? And I think, I suppose the things I'd point to would be a shared culture and vision and passion, something we were all working towards. A healthy respect for our different perspectives and backgrounds, and then building relationships to make things happen and to focus on delivery. And some of the things that helped that was, first of all, a mixture of people coming in from the outside and also some quite long-standing civil servants. And that really marbled all the way through the organisation, so at every level there were people from the outside and people from the inside. The Director General came from the outside, and there was strong political cover. And it being in the Cabinet Office kind of enabled us to work really tightly and effectively, both with the centre but also with the sector. And I suppose that's the environment I've seen it work. Where I've seen it not work is where those things are not in place. And in particular, I would say this is on both sides actually, I think it's wrong to just say it's the fault of government. It's where people come into government and just don't engage with the structures and processes. It doesn't mean to say you have to be bound and absolutely bound and kind of hampered by them, but you do need to respect them and find a way through them. And where I've seen it go wrong is too often either the kind of civil service kind of just out processes everybody and then you can't do anything, or people just come in and go, oh, this is all rubbish, let's tear it up and start again. And you can't do that. You have to find a way through. And I think so when you've got the right people in the right jobs with the right attitudes, it can work. But you need to think about those things, not just kind of a paper on, kind of a kind of policy on how do we do this better. It's about those kinds of things in place that will make it a great organisation and make you able to deliver for the public.
And that's once people are in, but do you have any observations also about what works for getting people to want to come in and out of government more effectively? That's something we've done a lot of work on.
Right. I mean, I've seen a lot of people wanting to come in and out of government. People, whatever people think about it, from the private sector, from the voluntary sector, from other bits of the public sector, I still think it's a very attractive place to be because it's the sense that you can really make a difference, and you don't always make a difference, and it can take an awful long time. But when you do make a difference, it's really quite seismic. So I think that is really attractive, and I think if you're coming into it for the money or the bonuses or the kudos, well, there's no point because that's we can never quite emulate other parts of the world, and you have to accept that if you're going to come in. So I think there is a sense we probably could make it a bit more attractive that way, but actually you need the people who are here to do the public service actually and want to do that and are prepared to kind of put the hard graft in.
Yes, we're not Singapore, paying Singapore salaries to civil servants.
No, we're not.
Ian, you're someone who's got an extensive private sector career behind you, but was attracted to go into government. What are your observations? We've seen sort of radically different attitudes, at least superficially, to business from politicians, from Boris Johnson's sort of attitude of what we should do to business, to other prime ministers sort of really sort of wanting to travel around the world and take lots of business leaders with them and so on. When does that relationship work well, and when does it? What could be done differently?
Well, just building on those comments, I think the challenge, and I'll just stick to the business world, but one of the things I did try and do in lead non-exec was attract more third sector expertise in, so it wasn't just business. I think this is really important. Neil was saying it's sort of multiple sets of experiences rather than just a sort of business or third sector in isolation. I think that the key thing about this is it's very hard, has been historically quite hard, to find ways for both sides of that, the civil service, government, and the private sector to actually mutually understand each other better because they don't actually spend much time together. And there isn't an easy pathway that you can say, right, go off and do 6 months in the Cabinet Office or come and run a project on IT or do this, basically secondment over there. And so it can, if it's not careful, fall into this mutual incomprehension where the more extreme, particularly right, I'm afraid, so in business tends to think everyone in government's useless. And the civil service think these people don't understand anything. And actually, the only way to make it better is to give more actual experience. And so Neil and I were talking earlier about if you do real work together, you tend to find you understand each other more. And the two ways I think you do real work, one is you have structures like the non-exec boards, which I think helped enormously improved the mutual understanding, and it also provided some expertise into organisations that perhaps couldn't attract it otherwise. But it massively informed the business community who were involved with it into how difficult government is. But so, structures, if there were, and I think George Osborne suggested, non-Commons or Lords ministers, for example, who come and do the job for 2 years, just that there isn't an easy exchange route, basically, here, because you have to sign up for sort of formal appointments, or you have to go through. So that was the joy of the non-exec bits. We could do a lot more of that. Or the alternative is, as Neil's saying, is we do particular projects. So you do something which has to get done. And I chaired the board that was handing out the sports support package from DCMS. And that was a classic example where actually I think we really helped government by bringing in a mix of outside, mix of sporting talent, but an objective view that allowed the government to say, yeah, we're seeing an independent, balanced assessment. Because the problem for a lot of government is the challenges they're facing are so systemic and so complicated that the idea you can sort of solve it with a bit of policy is often just not there. And policy is the first lever, but actually, to Neil's point, implementation, I've always found in business, is 9/10 of what you actually do. And that's where I think business can help, because I've seen a lot of this stuff and not all of it worked. And this idea that it's only government IT projects go wrong, I can assure you that's not the case. So I think that having those conversations improves the outcomes for everyone. And I think it's the private sector's job to engage with the government of the day to try and help the country succeed. And we can't just go in and do special case lobbying or ask for a handout. There is a real need to be involved, but it's really tricky finding these juncture points through people, through secondments, through projects, through particular missions. And I think the more we could have, clear, as the Institute for Government helpfully suggested, a strategy for government which then would work down into mission boards. And I really hope that in the next few months, weeks, we see the announcement of proper mission boards with some independent advisors on those boards, because I think that's where we could see real value add from outside government into government to help with delivery. But it's in the context of, if you can start with a strategy, then people will come and help and will want to get involved. But it's quite hard to find that way in. And
with your sort of private sector hat on, what are your observations about the current government's sort of attempts to engage with the private sector prior to government, and how that's panning out in the few weeks we've had since they've been in government?
Yeah. And obviously there was this sort of massive scrambled egg smoked salmon sort of assault on the city. I think it did actually work, because the city does now sort of want to give the government a chance, and is sort of probably a bit nervous about the budget, but is willing to sort of go in and say this is intended right. I think also what we've seen, some of the early quite iconic moves that the government has made, and James Timpson, know well from my retail days in justice and prisons, Peter Hendry for transport, and Patrick Vallance, and are all really encouraging appointments, because without turning it into a sort of government of all the talents, the ability to insert other people like that is fantastic. It is interesting, however, they have to go through the ministerial straitjacket and cope with the joys of the Lords process, which I know more about. And I do wonder whether there are other ways of getting more people involved to help support the delivery of the agenda. And it's very clear, any external person is not there to debate the agenda. They're invited into government to help deliver.
It does certainly seem possible that mission boards, whatever could be a way to try to do that, but we haven't really seen yet whether that's the intention.
Really hope that they manage to deliver it. It would be a great bit of joined-up government.
Yes, and as you say, on Lords ministers, I fear that sometimes the history is that good people come in to do something very specific, bringing their expertise, but the having to be in the Lords
at 10 o'clock at night
is the thing. Is the thing that sometimes does for them before their time. Diana, can I come to you? We often talk about how central government can learn from the voluntary sector, and things that are piloted at the sort of a smaller scale in the voluntary sector can then be learned from by government and scaled up. But how can that be done? Again, this seems to me to at least potentially relate to the emissions approach this government is saying it wants to take. But what are your observations on how that can be done?
Well, I suppose my starting point on almost everything, but including this, is, I think one needs to take a bit of time working out what's the problem you're trying to solve. And sometimes there can be a knee-jerk reaction from both sides, either government saying we need to talk to the voluntary sector, or the voluntary sector saying, why won't government listen? How can we, get our foot in the door? And I've been both sides of that experience. So I think spending a bit of time working out what's the problem we're trying to solve. Is this a policy issue, like we're in really early stages of development? Is it an outcome we're trying to deliver? And then what's the kind of mechanism for doing that? Is it a model that we've seen work really well in certain places that we want to scale up? Or is it an individual organisation? I think there's a different strategy for all of those. And I was very struck by what you said, Ian, about implementation, because I was very surprised, not in a good way, about how little implementation planning went on. And I only recognise that because of the 1,000,001 mistakes I've made myself in previous lives where I haven't planned the implementation properly. But when you've made those mistakes a few times, hopefully you don't keep repeating them. And I think execution, writing a strategy paper and saying you've talked to a lot of people and having listened to them and including their views is like 10% of the work, and 90% is implementation. So I think that's absolutely critical in all of this. And that, if I may, is also where we have to be realistic about the voluntary sector. The vast bulk of the voluntary sector is tiny. Yeah. And a lot of the organisations that Neil will have supported in that period in the fund, I remember well, will have been tiny, and that's totally fine. Those are inspired, brilliant people who are doing amazing things in their community on a kind of hyper-local basis. But that's really hard for government to grapple with. Government just needs to give them the money and tell them to go and do it, and not meddle. And some will work and some won't, and they won't be replicated and they won't be scaled, and that's cool. That's just as it should be. I remember meeting a woman who was 94 in Birmingham who ran a kind of thé dansant club, because I was Minister for Loneliness, so I was looking at everything that dealt with loneliness. And she did this club in the afternoon. It probably won't survive her, but that's all right. There'll be somebody who says, I do gardening in the afternoon. Government should just let those 1,000 flowers bloom. But where it's at the other end, so we could think of things, some of you will be familiar with PAWS, that works with women who've had multiple children removed into local authority care. That is an alignment of interests in terms of both policy development and implementation. And looking at those success stories, as Helen said, I think is important to kind of make sure we do it well in future. We? Who's we nowadays? Somebody else. Somebody else does it well.
I think we can all agree we want these things to work. I wanted to come back to you, Helen, and just ask about the role of sort of specific individuals within government. Sometimes government reaches for the model of having a sort of special advisor whose job it is to relate with a particular, to build relationships with a particular sector, and make sure that they sort of curate the input of that sector into government. Do you think that works well? Have you seen that work well, or is that putting too much reliance on individual?
I suppose coming back to that original experience that I had, one of the key things for us was that the Director General was from the outside. And I'm just thinking, we're talking about ministerial posts from the outside. I really think there needs to be more senior civil servants from the outside. We need to have the kind of courage to appoint somebody who doesn't really know what a submission is, or how to write a very elegantly worded note. We need people who can deliver at very senior levels, and that means bringing them in not through the normal routes of the civil service, but into new ways. So I think there is a need for that expertise to come in, and it needs to be at a political level, but also at an official level. There's enough people within government who can tell you how the system works around here. You need some people who can come in with the kind of vision and knowledge and expertise in terms of delivery, to kind of you need them both, but you need they can work together to deliver that.
I'd just build on, there are two other observations, which is delivery in government is very much more complicated than delivery in the private sector.
Yeah.
And the history of bringing people in too high has been pretty miserable, I think, in the civil service, in the sense that people bounce off the system. I always felt that the optimal route was sort of DGD, just to bring people in, so don't try and hire ex-CEOs as perm secs, because
I agree.
It's so much more complicated, and you do have to know where the system works. But that ability to move people in and out, if you can give them something tangible to do. So when I was at DWP, I looked at this and thought, this is the most fantastic train set for an IT guy, because it's a quarter of all the BACS transfers in the UK. If it goes wrong, it's total disaster. It's really exciting, the biggest toy set you ever get to play with. That sort of thing, you should be able to attract people in, because you can give them something tangible as opposed to lose them. And I think then the other related one was to say, if you can bring people in obvious areas of functional expertise. So I think John Manzoni's functional agenda was very involved. So having finance directors that are finance qualified, I think, is a good thing. You know, we should probably have more of that. Having HR directors who've been HR directors, good thing. And I think being more open to that idea that you will have multiple ways in and multiple sets of talents that you can use. But we've got to be planning to make it happen. At the moment, it feels a bit like, I sort of hope someone will come and we'll try and recruit people. It's not, to the early point, it's not systemic, I don't think.
And the new government has gotten itself into a little bit of trouble with
exciting appointments.
Some appointments with people with expertise, but also some political affiliations, which has raised some eyebrows.
Yeah, I mean, personally, things like the idea of Alan Milburn helping Wes Streeting sort out the health service strikes me is a very sensible idea, because he's actually had to try and do it before. I'm sure they're going to get lots of problems with, you know, the optics of these announcements. I'd much rather have those people being invited in to talk on the basis of real expertise. It's obviously trickier, but all governments have always made political appointments. And, you know, I would be much more interested, you know, a bit like the IfG, the quality of government and expertise rather than the politics, I think, is the test I'd apply.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we've always argued is that government shouldn't be afraid to appoint more special advisors who can absolutely be people with political expertise, but there's always a caution around that, because they don't want to be seen to be spending money on political advice. But actually, we see special advisors as sometimes a really important interface between ministers and civil servants. Neil, can I come back to you? I think I know what you're going to say in answer to this, but I'll ask it anyway. Where do you think responsibility for external engagement should sit? We thought about it in the context of the Centre Commission, very much about the responsibility of the centre for making sure this happens, and we saw that the centre, one of the problems with successive centres over different administrations has been that they're too close, that they start to develop a sort of bunker mentality. They ask, you know, they seek and give their own advice to themselves without having that external perspective. But there's also something about departments being open to external advice. Where do you think the sort of balance of responsibility lies?
Well, I think it's as much cultural mindset as anything. I mean, structures and locations of individual ownership are, of course, important. But to me, there's a fundamental opportunity to change the way we think about some of this problem solving. And I think there are examples in other parts of the world where governments are taking some quite unusual approaches to how they're addressing this problem. And I think, so the Australian Labor government, for example, have set a target to double philanthropy by 2030. And that's because they have structurally understood and accepted as a matter of policy the relationship between the need for economic development and social cohesion. And they are changing the way they are wiring their civil service and how it opens up very many more avenues. And I think that there's also some really interesting things going on in Singapore, in other places. So I don't think we should be afraid to examine alternative answers to that question, fundamentally driven by what is demonstrated to work. because I think such is the nature of the systemic problems. I feel that the political leadership and the civil service leadership need to sort of genuinely and deeply believe in it. And then, you know, if at the time that really hard problems are being examined as to alternative approaches, that we get to the point where the question of match funding. You know, we're constantly told that there is no money. Well, you know, we've got examples that if we had a match first principle in all departments across the board, to say where are the opportunities to crowdsource additional funding in support of very specific problem solving, and as Ian said, you know, mission-led government. I mean, the voluntary sector, it is the original mission kind of sector. So I do think plumbing within governments, that balance of central and departmental ownership and devolution is important. But I think there's something further upstream, which is around the cultural mindset of decision makers as they're wrestling with some of these problems.
Can I come back to you, Diana, on that one? Do you agree? Is it just as much about culture as it is about structures?
Well, I think form follows function, unoriginally. And obviously the civil service is very strong on structures and processes. And I was just thinking as I was listening to everyone, you know, the number of times I was advised not to meet an external person. I would say, honestly, 9 times out of 10, I was told it wasn't a good idea, which slightly made me, in a rather childish way, dig my heels in. But anyway, but I think, I used to work, I ran a domestic abuse charity for many years, and I worked with somebody who had more EQ in her little finger than I will ever have, overall. But she used to say, just because you don't ask someone what they think, doesn't stop them thinking it. And I just thought that so often in government. You know, we don't have to agree. We have to be brave enough to say that doesn't actually fit with our priorities. I'm sorry, I totally respect your point of view, but actually that doesn't work for us, and here's why. But not asking someone and not hearing, I think, is insufficient.
Okay, I'm going to start weaving in some questions I'm getting in through Slido, but if you're in the room, do also start to think about what questions you would like to ask the panel. I'm going to take the top-rated question. If you're on Slido, you can up-rate your questions that are already there if you particularly like them, rather than just asking a version yourself. Roy Abraham asks, who decides what is acceptable as an external voice? Should it be someone who's worked in a similar role before, or someone completely outside that role who may rock the system to the discomfort of the minister or senior civil servant? And I think this is where, in this one, we're talking about people being brought in. I guess we can refer back to Dominic Cummings' Misfits and Weirdos and that sort of push that he was trying to get people in. Do you have a view on this one, Anna?
Well, I think either the minister can decide or the civil servants can decide in their own way, or certainly strongly advise. I think, to be fair, the worry is that there's a perception that one group is favoured over another, and that's so one has to work through ways of getting past that. But ultimately, the minister should say who they want to see and stick to it and justify it. And, like all of these things, you should never see anybody you're not prepared to tell the world you met. You shouldn't say anything you're not prepared to see on the front page of the paper. You must behave honourably. You should have your private office there. So often, I would say so-and-so who, I know from 100 years ago would like to come in. and they would say, is it a political meeting, Minister, or would you like us there? I always wanted them there. You know, there shouldn't be any secrets. I think transparency is also helpful in this.
Yeah. I mean, just from the non-exec experience, I think we started out trying generally to get good balance, and frankly, it's the same challenge in the corporate world. If you don't have enough diversity of thought styles around the room, you get groupthink, and that's where most businesses fail. So that a balance of independence, and I think one of the things that happened to the, frankly, the non-exec network was it was turned into a sort of semi-SPAD political advisory version by the end. And one of the things I was trying to encourage the current government to do is don't fire all the old cronies, which they seem to have done, and replace them with new cronies. You know, you do need to have grown-ups in the room who've got demonstrable capability. But to my mind, it was the diversity of thinking style, willingness to get involved, but to also understand, which was always really clear when talking to my cohort, was we are not here to do the policy work, we're here to do the implementation. And that makes it a much more defined role that you can get into. I think it's harder when you're in the political sphere making trade-offs. But I think that willingness to take, that there is a sort of sniff test on quality, and it should be fairly obvious. I agree, it's probably the Minister and Prime Ministers making those calls. But if you start with the culture, which is I think where the coalition did well, is they said they wanted to get people in, and they were looking for talent, and it were not looking for political affiliations. And I think that is, if you apply those two tests, I think you can normally find good people.
Hannah, may I just listen to, can I just very briefly come back in, because there's one thing we haven't talked about, and it may or may not be relevant, so tell me to stop if it isn't, but it's just who you talk to in a crisis. Yes. So, and that happens in government in a way that I think, you know, apart from maybe the big BP disaster, but, you know, it doesn't happen as frequently in the private sector or in the voluntary sector. So we've all just seen the Grenfell report. I had to deal with the crumbling concrete in schools this time last year. Oh my God, I might start shaking. But actually, it was interesting then. So, you know, I was advised not to go and talk to the Crosses parents, and I felt I had to go and talk to the Crosses parents. I'm not trying to paint myself as an angel, but I'm just saying it's a different dynamic, and one where you have to decide very, very quickly what you're going to do. So
No, I think it's a really
just because it hasn't come up.
Really important and relevant. Neil, I wanted to pick up on this point that Diana raised about what the civil service thinks of as evidence, as who is worth listening to, of which voices should be in the room with political people. If politicians aren't asking to, you know, for who they want to see, are there any issues with the civil service perspective? And I'm thinking that, you know, one of the things we talk about a lot as a problem here at the Institute is the level of churn there is in the civil service and people moving on between jobs. Is there a problem around a sort of institutional knowledge of who there is to talk to about different things?
I'm sure that's true, and I'm sure that's not unique to the civil service. I mean, corporate memory in businesses, in charities, the rate of turnover is dramatically higher in the last 5 or 10 years than what we would have been historically used to. So, you know, I think the challenge of all leaders, irrespective of sector, is as you're facing into problems, how do you just either hire or give yourself access to the most talented voices that you can afford, and then try and create the environment within which they do great stuff. And you know, that's the challenge of a civil servant department. It's a challenge of a Kingfisher. It's all organisations. And I think it's just a fact of modern life and leadership that new dynamic is one aspect of the complexity of modern leadership against the backdrop of some of the problems we've got.
That's very interesting. Okay, let's take some questions from the room. I think one of my colleagues has, yes, Lauren has a microphone. Can you come to the gentleman here at the front? We'll take questions in groups of 3. If you would like to tell us who you are, that would be great. And if you would like to direct your question to a particular member of the panel, that would also be great, if there is someone you want to direct it to.
No, this is for the entire panel. Actually, my name's Paul Atherton. I'm a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, a creative associate for the Museum of Homelessness. And during my 15 years of homelessness per se, I have also been a lived experience advisor to Bob Blackman on the Homelessness Reduction Bill, and a lived experience to the Mayor of London Rough Sleeping team. And one of the things that we've noticed of late is that charities and representatives of charities, especially in the homelessness sector, are not reflecting what people experiencing homelessness are reflecting. And I was wondering if the panel knew, how do you get an individual voice that represents the people experiencing something in to see ministers and civil servants when the very institutions, third sector institutions, don't necessarily represent what's actually happening?
Good question. The lady here.
Hi, my name's Hebe. I run a social enterprise that connects frontline practitioners with policymakers. And I suppose I kind of wanted to ask a question around that. You know, we've talked a lot about external voices coming in and particularly around the implementation execution side. It feels to me, and we've seen this a lot across the last 5 years, there's huge expertise on the front line within sort of government employees in probation or adult social care, etc. How would you place them within this conversation of bringing external voices into decision making?
Mm-hmm. Great. One more question from the room.
Thank you. I'm James Gins from the Centre for Long-Term Resilience. I'd like to ask the panel their views on external voices providing scrutiny over areas of government from outside, but speaking into government. The COVID inquiry, for example, has recommended the first report has recommended independent body to scrutinise work being done on resilience. Is there any record of sort of success, examples of success with external voices speaking from a scrutiny perspective? Thanks.
Great, 3 excellent questions. So, role of external voices in scrutiny, frontline employees, and how they can engage with policymakers, and lived experience, and how if you've got a kind of permafrost layer between ministers and people who are actually experiencing something, how you can get through that. Who would like to tackle any of those?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, actually, and I think it goes more to it's a big question mark for the charity sector, actually, in the sense of the legitimacy of the charity sector has to come from the people who experience and use the services or the areas that it provides. So I think the question mark is, you shouldn't have, it shouldn't be a disconnect between the experiences of the people who use or have, for whom the charity is set up, and then how that's communicated in or with government. So I think that's a big question, and one in which we talked a lot when we were talking about at the Charity Commission, talking about governance. It's really important to get that into the governance of the charity, otherwise you will end up with this disconnect as you described. So I think if you're in government, then you need to quality assess and double check, is this legitimate voices coming in on behalf of people, and if not, how do you get that? How do you do that listening in a more productive way?
But just going back to this point about finding mechanisms, one of the things I was on the board of Business in the Community, and one of the things that these issues about seeing both the lived experience and the frontline stuff, they're essentially the same problem, which is how do you get right to the front end of a real issue as opposed to being filtered up. And I'd say taking CEOs around deprived parts of Manchester or the North is a real eye-opener, because until they get the direct experience, they don't emotionally internalise it, and they just sort of can just not connect. So finding regular mechanisms, and in the corporate world we used to do this because I would go to focus groups in the stores of customers, and then I go through to focus groups of teams. So I made sure I was there on my own, talking to people. I probably wouldn't be allowed to do it as a minister, but anyway, there we go. But it was that direct contact, but it had to be systemised a bit to make sure it actually happened, because otherwise you get, in all organisations, the further up you go, you get driven away from the front line, be it the teams or the lived experience, and you've actually got to fight to get yourself reconnected, and unless you're trying to get reconnected, it won't.
No.
Yeah, I mean, I was struck. I think the first gentleman who talked about essentially the legitimacy of the voice. I sort of cut my teeth in the disability rights movement, and there's a phraseology that I rather like from that talks about nothing about us without us. And that sentiment is really straightforward, and most people kind of buy into it. But the practicality of making that happen takes a lot of work.
Organisation, yeah.
And you know, the program that I mentioned earlier, one of the CAF Resilience Fund, in working with both the civil servants and with our corporate partners who were supporting that initiative, we really struggled to broker the very, very legitimate deep voices for people with disability, for people of colour, for young adults that were being reskilled between 16 and 30. And because of that struggle, we flipped it and actually managed to partner with some organisations who really effectively helped all of those stakeholders achieve and hear in a very systematic way. So for disability, we partnered with Scope, and for people with colour, the Baobab Foundation, and so on. So organisations who were deeply wired into those communities. But it wasn't straightforward, and it took a lot of work, and it wasn't perfect. But it was sufficient that it changed and provided an input that affected some of the choices that were made around what ended up being executed.
That's really interesting. Would you like to tackle the scrutiny question?
Well, I thought you might say that. So I've been frantically thinking about the scrutiny question. I think it's a really great question. And I was trying to think whether I could find an example of where it's been done really brilliantly, and nothing popped into my head, but others around the room or online might have examples. I think it would be really useful to look at those. I suppose what I would suggest is that it's critical to get alignment about what the objectives are for greater resilience, and then what the role is of a scrutiny board, and what are they actually monitoring, because otherwise, and we've already touched on the fact that in various organisations people change all the time, so you've got these super dedicated scrutiny people who are there forever, and then everybody else comes in and out, has to be got up to speed, which can be incredibly frustrating on a human level, or vice versa. But I heard a phrase this morning which I quite like, which is, we may not be correct, but we know where we're going. So if you're not aligned, the chances of you achieving what you want to achieve are close to zero. If you are aligned, you might not get there, but at least you have a sporting chance of getting there. So I would say that time invested in working out exactly what the role, the responsibilities, however, I'm sorry, I'm telling you everything you already know, but that would be where I think there could be an anxiety to kind of rush into doing stuff, and that's good, but I would spend a bit of time up front saying, actually, how are we going to measure this, and are we all on the same page, or has everybody separately got a different idea of what success looks like?
I think just to add on the scrutiny, I mean, there are quite a lot of candidates to provide scrutiny, from the NAO to select committees to others. I think, and typically our system tends to reach for external scrutiny when something's gone horribly wrong, like Grenfell or public inquiries. I think to have a drumbeat of regular reporting scrutiny is much more, from a departmental point of view, the thing that I was looking for, which again, I'm afraid takes you back to, have you got a plan? Have you got some measures of success? How do we think we're doing? And that then is one of the things that I think is a read across from the corporate world, is the board can provide scrutiny of the organisation at a strategic level. It's not going to do the detailed operational stuff. But it also can scrutinise things like capabilities, which I think are the other key thing that we don't spend enough time on. So after this, I'm off to do a talent succession review, which is, to my mind, a key part of what I do as a board director. And I would expect similar parallel opportunities like that. But if anything, I think there's a sort of absolute smorgasbord of scrutiny at the moment in and around government, and it's an area that definitely repays further work. So great question.
And just to pick up on your select committee point, I think there's been some interesting developments in relation to this agenda by select committees.
Yep.
In the last Parliament, more use of sort of deliberative sort of techniques and so on. Justice Committee and the Commons did some really interesting work on sentencing where they used sort of more public engagement techniques. So the scrutiny body is trying to listen to different voices in different ways, I think is an interesting development. I wanted to come back, Dana, to you in passing mentioned that something about the engagement needing to be at the right time, not rushing into things in the wrong direction. We've got a couple of questions which touch on this, which have come in online. One from Gillian, she's saying, how do you ensure external voices are brought in at the right time? Past experience suggests that government consults those with relevant experience, but only at the point when things are far too far down the line to change anything. And there's also a question from Emma Jones, who says, it's a related question, how do you ensure a diverse range of external voices and perspectives are included in external consultations while maintaining an effective and efficient policy development process? So you've got to get the policy to a certain point, you've got to implement it, but how do you do that in a way which still opens the funnel, I guess, in terms of who you're bringing in? I'm putting this unfairly all to you because
no, it's fine, and anyone else
in
can
government.
chip in. So I think on the too late, I think Gillian's answered her own question, which is, if the issue is we're going to develop a new policy, then bring in people before you've started locking it down. And in fact, at that real, when you're sticking post-it notes on a wall or however you do it, because, for the reasons that she gave. In terms of a diverse range of voices responding to consultations, so in theory, consultations are open to everyone and everybody can reply. In practice, they're not very user-friendly documents usually. And I was involved, if I just give a case where, one of the very contentious issues is parents who want to educate their children at home, and should there be more oversight by the local authority of children who are home educated. And some of the consultation we did on the guidance, was just incomprehensible and also so long. So I think we can also be a bit more creative about what's the documents that you put out that allow people, can you put in a video clip? If you're consulting young people, let's not, some of them, they can answer 25 pages of questions, or they can send in a video clip of their experience. And actually some really interesting work was starting using AI to be able to analyse consultation responses much, much more quickly. Then that probably doesn't answer the question. It's a starter for 10.
I suppose what's I'm reflecting on with this is that we're talking about listening and consulting, which is pretty much done too. You're doing something to somebody. And it's the question for me is, how do you get to more of a partnership approach to developing and implementing policy? And that's the bit where it's much more embedded, much more integrated. And that to me would be the holy grail, something that if we could get that would be really, it's not just about doing something to a member of the public or people who use your services, and that requires the cultural and respect bit on both sides to be able to work for the long term. And I think we're quite a long way off doing that, but we should be able to do it.
I do work, so we're going to have to shoot. One other thing I'd say is, again, designing different ways to make those connections. I've just finished chairing something called the Food Farming Countryside Commission. We've run 4 food conversations around the countries with citizens, and they're not quite citizens' assemblies, they're not quite focus groups, they're big scale, lots of video, lots of different ways of talking about, and talking about some of the connections between health policy, food policy and outcomes. absolutely fascinating, the level of input that people wanted to give to that, and to go beyond the usual suspects, because that thing about who you're talking to, actually to the, go back frontline and lived experience. Unless you're connecting to the right level, you're probably not talking to the right people. But you've again got to design an intervention that allows it. And I've been really impressed with the quality of the feedback that we had on that, and the richness of that dialogue. So I think there's a lot more we can do, and I'm afraid
No, you have to go, Ian. Thank you so much for joining us.
Just very quickly to sort of add to Helen's point, I think all I would say about, partnership and co-production, all of that, is that one needs to be super clear who's accountable and who's responsible at the end. And I think where it goes wrong is if you create something together and then only government is left responsible. And that's why I think some of the collective impact bonds and social impact bonds, well executed, can be a very good example of that, because everybody, is you align accountability and responsibility. And the other thing I think one can do, and I would like to say I always did it, I absolutely didn't always do it, but I did occasionally do it, is if you bring a group of people in and you ask them their advice, and then you go away and work on it, you get them back in, you say, we took these bits from what you told us because X, and it just feels respectful.
Absolutely. I think we've got time for one more question from the room. If there is one, gentleman at the back.
To end on a positive note, I thought you might want to know about the Crown Representative Programme, which is something which the Cabinet Office is running to bring in commercial expertise from the business sector directly into the heart of government. And there are about 20 commercial executives with 30 years experience each. And collectively, we've brought in practices from the private sector and saved, £1 billion, which sounds like a lot of money, but obviously not that much when you're dealing with the huge sums of money. But that's a constant dialogue between civil servants and businesses. And if you like, we act as translators for the business world into the Cabinet Office and vice versa. And that could be replicated, I think, across different sectors. And I echo what Sir Ian said about having Manzoni there made a big difference, because one of the things that civil servants are scared of is taking risk, because they get punished for risk taking but not rewarded for initiative. And that's something I think we need to look at. But that's something to observe, and that's something that I think is working.
Thank you. That was a positive note to end on. Well, I hope you will agree with me that that was a really interesting discussion. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you again to CAF for sponsoring this event, and I hope you'll join me in thanking our excellent panel.